I love Spider-Man. I've loved Spider-Man for as long as I can remember, and I certainly loved the character before the MCU ever decided to bring him in. Look, I was eventually going to need to make a hot take video, and I guess this had to be the first one. When it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think that the relationship between Peter Parker and Tony Stark comes off as completely fabricated and unearned. Now, this isn't something new. I've always felt this way. I felt this way as the movies were coming out when the MCU was at its peak. And most of the time I was met with vitriol from MCU stans for daring to question the almighty Feige empire. I'm so glad we're now in a time where we can talk candidly about the MCU without having to pretend like everything they made was perfect. Even then, I think people go too easy with the whole "the MCU fell off after Endgame" narrative. No, the MCU had glaring issues even before Endgame, but you chose to ignore them due to the novelty of a shared universe and the ha-has. I want to make this clear once again. I love Spider-Man, and I truly believe the superhero genre can produce genuinely great films when the right minds are involved. So while yes, I'll be honest, I hated the creative decision to make Tony Stark Peter Parker's mentor in the MCU, I had to roll with it and at least hope they did a good job handling their relationship and making it worthwhile. And well, here I am making this video. Where do I even start with this mess? And yes, it is a mess. This all really started when the MCU made the bold decision to skip Peter Parker's origin story. And they weren't quiet about it either. They basically said, "Nobody needs to see Uncle Ben die again," and everyone clapped like it was some revolutionary move. And to be fair, it could have been. Skipping the origin wasn't a bad idea on paper, but looking back, it's pretty clear they didn't have a fully confident plan for where this version of Spider-Man was going. We'll get into that. The problem is, by skipping that origin, the story assumes Peter has already gone through the most important emotional arc of his life, the Uncle Ben tragedy, without actually showing it. And that decision creates a ripple effect that throws off everything that follows. Peter's introduction into the MCU came through Tony Stark in Civil War. He's recruited straight from his bedroom in Queens, and in that scene he drops a line that's basically a jumbled remix of "with great power comes great responsibility." That line is meant to signal that Peter has already gone through his most defining emotional moment, the loss of Uncle Ben, even if the movie refuses to name it. And yeah, it's clear the MCU was trying to be different. They didn't want to rehash what Raimi and Webb had already shown, so instead of showing Uncle Ben's death again, they just vaguely referenced it and moved on. But here's where things start to feel off. Because when we jump into Homecoming, that emotional foundation basically disappears. Peter's not wrestling with guilt or trying to live up to some moral code. Instead, his entire motivation is suddenly about impressing Tony Stark. He's obsessed with becoming an Avenger, and any reference to Uncle Ben or Peter's personal sense of responsibility is nowhere to be found. It's like his defining trauma got replaced by a celebrity crush. Let's stop and ask, what exactly did Peter go through in Civil War that would explain this sudden ride or die loyalty to Tony Stark? He gets recruited, flown to Germany, and thrown into a superhero turf war with zero context. He barely knows who half these people are. And sure, he's excited. I mean, what teenager wouldn't be starstruck fighting alongside the Avengers? But once the airport dust settles, he gets injured, sent home, and that's it. There's no bonding moment, no emotional scene where Tony mentors him or earns Peter's trust. Nothing to suggest this becomes a defining relationship in Peter's life. So the idea that by Homecoming, Peter is checking his phone every 5 minutes for validation from Stark, that he's ditched local crime to chase global heroics because Tony might call, it just doesn't track, I'm sorry. If anything, it feels like we skipped a whole movie between Civil War and Homecoming, one where Tony actually trains him, mentors him, earns that bond, all the emotional groundwork the MCU just didn't bother to show. And that's one of my biggest issues with the MCU in general. We're just supposed to be fine with key character development happening off screen. But that kind of thing goes completely against what good writing is supposed to do. If you're asking the audience to feel something, then show us why it matters. Is this just the cost of having a giant shared universe? Yeah, probably. But does that mean I have to just go along with it without asking questions? Absolutely not. And whenever anyone brings this up, the go-to defense is always, well, Peter's just a kid. But let's be real, in the MCU, he's just a kid turned into code for. We can write him however we want, and you're not allowed to question it. At times, it felt less like Peter was a teenager figuring things out and more like he was just lobotomized, for lack of a better term. Like they used his age as a get out of jail free card anytime the writing got lazy. By the time Homecoming rolls around, the movie opens with that classic MCU style joke, Peter thinking Tony's giving him a hug when it's just him reaching for the door. And I guess that's all we're supposed to need to buy into this whole father-son dynamic? From there, Peter's entire arc is centered around wanting to impress Tony Stark, who's clearly more of a distant boss than a father figure. He barely shows up, and when he does, it's either through Happy or a remote control Iron Man suit. At one point, he saves Peter from drowning. Now, to give credit where it's due, this is actually one of the better Tony and Peter moments in the entire MCU. It's one of the few times where their relationship feels like it's actually being built, like Tony genuinely wants to mentor Peter. But even then, we're still nowhere near anything resembling a father-son dynamic, no matter how much people like to frame it that way. But if this was really the direction they wanted to go in, I just wish Homecoming gave us more. Right after this scene, everything starts to feel rushed. The next major moment is Tony showing up during the ferry disaster, and then it's straight into the suit confiscation and the Avengers offer. It's like they crammed an entire potential movie's worth of development into a few scattered scenes. And honestly, I think this dynamic could have really worked. This was a seed they never watered, and by the time they expected us to cry over it, it barely had roots. Then we get to the tough love moment where Tony takes the suit back and says, "I wanted you to be better." But even that doesn't feel heartfelt. It feels like a manager disappointed in one of his employees, and somehow from that, Peter learns that he doesn't need the Stark suit to be Spider-Man. He even turns down joining the Avengers at the end to stay grounded and do his own thing. And then in the very next movie, he's back to obsessing over Tony like none of that growth ever happened. There's actually a way all of this could have made sense though. If Peter was latching on to Tony because he was missing a father figure after losing Uncle Ben, that would have been totally believable. It wouldn't even have needed a big dramatic monologue, just a line, a photo, a quiet moment to show that part of Peter's heart was still healing. But the MCU never gave us that, not once. The MCU and Kevin Feige made Uncle Ben a dirty word. The movies went out of their way to avoid mentioning him, and because of that, we never got any writing or visual cue that Peter saw Tony as filling that emotional void. And look, if you choose to read it that way, that's fine, but just because it's your headcanon doesn't mean it's what the movies actually showed us. That's the difference between a story that earns its emotional beats and one that hopes the audience fills in the gaps for them. What's wild is that a lot of people actually gaslit themselves into believing this was the case, that Tony filled the emotional void left by Uncle Ben, that Peter saw him as a true father figure. And again, that would have made sense if the movies had actually shown us any of it. But then No Way Home comes along and completely undoes that headcanon. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now let's talk about the Stark suit. I know people will argue that giving Peter such advanced tech is proof of how much Tony cared about him and the reason for Peter to latch onto Tony. But if we're sticking to this father-son dynamic that everyone swears by, it honestly feels more like a rich parent spoiling their kid with expensive toys than a deeply emotional gesture. Why? Well, because he's just handing him this shiny new toy to do Tony a favor and fucking off afterwards. Like I said before, we needed more moments like the one where Tony saves Peter from drowning if they wanted me to buy into this dynamic. One scene isn't enough. Just handing someone a suit doesn't build a relationship either. And I can already hear people saying, well, maybe Tony regretted not appreciating Peter more, that's why him getting blipped hit so hard. But that's the thing, none of that actually happens on screen. There's no real arc showing Tony coming to that realization or any moment where their bond truly matures. What we're doing is retrofitting emotional weight onto scenes that didn't earn it, based on headcanons and wishful thinking. The relationship people defend isn't the one we were shown, it's the one they wanted to see. What really frustrates me is how Infinity War and Endgame try to cash in on this emotional bond between Peter and Tony that was never actually built. In Infinity War, Peter gets dusted in Tony's arms, and it's played like this massive "oh no" moment. Slow fade, dramatic music, Peter saying, "I don't want to go," and everyone online losing it. Here's my hot take. Peter's blip scene hits hard because of Tom Holland's acting and the simple fact that he's a teenager facing death. But the extra emotional weight Marvel tries to pile on by having him fall into Tony's arms doesn't land for me. That part of their dynamic just wasn't earned. Their relationship hadn't been developed enough on screen to justify the father-son level of heartbreak the movie wanted us to feel. In short, I felt bad for Peter, but not for Tony. Then in Endgame, they really shoved this unearned relationship down our throats. After being stuck in space for 22 days after the snap, Tony is finally saved and returns to Earth. He sees Steve Rogers for the first time in years, since the events of Civil War, mind you. And the first thing he tells him is, "I couldn't stop him, I lost the kid." I hated this line then and I hate it now. From a writing standpoint, it feels forced, like the line exists purely to remind the audience of Tony and Peter's special bond, rather than being something Tony would naturally say. It's especially weird when you consider that Steve has no real context for this relationship. Sure, he saw Spider-Man briefly in Civil War, but he hasn't spoken to Tony since then. For all Steve knows, the kid could literally be anyone. It feels less like Tony dwelling on Peter despite everything he's already been through, and more like the script is nudging the audience saying, "Hey, remember Spider-Man? Feel sad now." Here's the thing. Tony and Steve actually had a well-developed relationship. They are a good example of the MCU organically growing a dynamic and relationship between two fundamentally different characters. I find it hard to believe that after everything these two have been through, after not having talked for years, that would be the first thing Tony tells Steve. The funny thing is, Tony bringing up the kid would have made way more sense in the very next scene where he's actually ranting at Steve and blaming him for losing against Thanos. It would have actually felt natural. But perhaps the most ridiculous and over-the-top example of this relationship feeling so phony comes next. After the time jump in Endgame, we're shown that Tony now has a framed photo of him and Peter in his home after the MCU themselves continually showed us that he was more of a buy your kid a new toy and neglect them type of mentor in previous films. And the funny part is that it's supposed to play as this wholesome Keanu Reddit-ass moment, but it only works if you already believe they were close. And I'm just sitting there like, since when? When did they become this inseparable duo? Did that happen off screen? And if it did, why should I care about something I never got to see? And then there's the big one. I'm apparently supposed to believe that Tony Stark invented time travel because he saw a photo of Peter. That's the emotional trigger. That's what gets the genius billionaire to crack quantum mechanics, not his daughter, not the half of humanity that disappeared. A selfie with a kid he hung out with like what, twice? Again, it only hits if you've bought into this idea that Peter was the emotional center of Tony's world, which the movies never actually show. I'm sounding like a broken record here, I'm sorry. They tell us that was the case in Endgame, but the relationship just wasn't written that way. So when the camera lingers on that framed photo like it's supposed to be this beautiful, heartbreaking motivator, I just can't buy it, because we never saw that version of their relationship. It was manufactured after the fact, hoping we'd just go along with it. And that's the big problem. The relationship wasn't developed, it was implied, and then emotionally cashed in like it had been earned. And none of this would annoy me nearly as much if so many people hadn't bought into this phony dynamic. And let's not forget the groan-inducing reunion between Tony and Peter during the final battle in Endgame. It's framed like this massive, world-stopping emotional moment. Honestly, it gets more dramatic treatment than Tony and Steve's reconciliation, which, actually had years of conflict and build-up behind it. But this hug, this "oh my god, they're finally back together" moment, it's based on what exactly? A couple of quips and one emotional dusting scene? Meanwhile, actual relationships that were carefully developed didn't get a fraction of that spotlight. Where was my Rocket and Groot reunion? Two fully CGI characters, no star power, no slow-mo hug, but a relationship that James Gunn actually took time to build. We knew they cared for each other. Rocket literally lost everyone in Infinity War, including Groot. And yet in the big, triumphant return scene, nothing. No hug, no line, just chaos. But hey, we had to make time for the Tony and Peter hug because that was the moment we're supposed to care about. And finally, we get, "Mr. Stark, we won." Peter says it while Tony is dying, and it's framed like the emotional climax of their entire relationship, as if this was the most important connection in both of their lives. But at this point, it just feels hollow. We're told to cry, but we were never really shown why. And honestly, Peter, what even was your best memory with Tony? What's the moment you're holding on to so tightly that makes you love this guy like a second father? Was it the time he gave you a fancy suit and ghosted you through Happy? The line plays like it's closing the book on a deep emotional journey, but there was barely a chapter to begin with. It feels like Marvel wrote, "Mr. Stark, we won" first, then built an entire fake relationship around it after the fact, hoping the music, the acting, and the legacy of the characters would be enough to make it land. And honestly, all of this forced father-son framing ends up belittling Tony's real relationships. Pepper, Rhodey, even Happy, these are the people who actually knew Tony for years, yet the movies consistently push Peter to the emotional forefront as if their bond carried the same weight. It doesn't, it never did. Peter is treated almost like an infant throughout these films, both by the characters and by the audience who fully bought into this overblown father-son dynamic. When you guys could have pushed back, you instead bought into the hype with your headcanons, which only made this ham-fisted and hollow relationship worse. And as if this wasn't already bad enough, we have to see Spider-Man fucking grieving Tony Stark for the entirety of the next movie. Like fully mourning him, wearing his glasses, dodging his legacy, living in his shadow. The whole plot of Far From Home is built on Peter trying to figure out if he can live up to Tony. And I'm sitting there thinking, why is this kid more broken up about losing Tony Stark than he ever was about Uncle Ben? It's like the MCU said, okay, we're finally giving Spider-Man a story about grief and responsibility, but we're gonna make it all about Iron Man. Cool. This would be great if I actually gave a shit about this industry plant relationship. And what makes it even weirder is that Far From Home basically gives Peter the exact same arc he already went through in Homecoming. In that movie, the whole point was that the suit doesn't make the man. Peter learns that he doesn't need Tony's tech or the Avengers or external validation to be Spider-Man. He even turns down the offer to officially join the team. Growth, right? Then Far From Home rolls around and Peter's like, am I worthy of Tony Stark's legacy? Dude, you literally already learned that. You don't need to be Iron Man. Why are we doing this again? It's the same crisis, just with more holograms and Stark tech. The movie tries to sell it as this deeper, more emotional journey because now Tony is dead, but it's still the same message. You have to be your own hero, and again, the emotional core is shaky because the foundation was never there in the first place. There's a reason Far From Home is often seen as the weakest entry in the Home trilogy, and it's because Spider-Man just doesn't feel like Spider-Man in this movie. And yeah, the Tony Stark grief arc plays a big role in that, but it's not the only issue. Peter makes decisions in this film that feel so wildly out of character, like giving Mysterio full control of a global drone strike system because the guy said some nice things and wore a cape. That's not young and naive, that's reckless. He unleashes literal death machines over Europe and then spends half the movie moping about Tony instead of, I don't know, taking a second to wonder why someone like Tony thought he was the right guy to inherit murder satellites in the first place. The movie keeps insisting that Peter is struggling under the weight of Tony's legacy, but that legacy only matters if we believe their relationship had that kind of weight to begin with. It didn't. So instead of feeling like an honest emotional arc, it just feels like Peter is trapped in a story that's more about Iron Man's absence rather than Spider-Man's growth. And if I ever have to watch Spider-Man tinkering with tech while AC/DC blares in the background again, I'm gonna fucking vomit. Alright, so now we get to No Way Home, the big one. The moment where the MCU finally admits, without actually saying it out loud, that none of what came before really mattered. Because in this movie, it's confirmed Uncle Ben meant nothing. He's not referenced, he's not mourned, he's not the emotional core of Peter's journey. And despite years of people swearing that Tony was his Uncle Ben, that theory gets tossed out too. No Way Home goes out of its way to give Aunt May the "with great power comes great responsibility" moment. And it's only after her death that Peter finally becomes the Spider-Man we've known for decades. So what was all that Tony Stark mentorship bullshit about? What was all the emotional weight in Endgame supposed to mean? Apparently nothing. It was a detour. And the craziest part? This is the origin story Marvel swore we didn't need. Remember, although we're skipping the origin, you've seen it before talk? That aged like milk. Because after 2.5 movies of tech suits, shield drones, and Avengers brand mentorship, the MCU finally pivots. Finally gives us a broke, alone, consequence-ridden Spider-Man. But now it's messy, because it took 3 whole movies and the deaths of both Aunt May and Tony Stark to get there. This wasn't a carefully built arc. This was Marvel reacting to the criticism and going, okay fine, here's the real Spider-Man, you happy now? And that's why all the talk about this being the most comic accurate Spider-Man from the start just doesn't hold up. Because clearly Marvel themselves didn't believe that. If they did, they wouldn't have gone through this entire trilogy just to hit the reset button at the end. Now, of course, some people are going to swear this was always the plan, that Marvel had a brilliant 3-movie arc in mind where Peter slowly earns the Spider-Man title by the end. But let's be real, there's no way this was the plan from day one. Nothing about the first 2 movies hinted at this kind of arc at all. There's no emotional breadcrumb trail, no setup for Aunt May to take Uncle Ben's role, no slow burn of Peter learning hard lessons without a safety net. It wasn't structured that way, it was a reaction. This was Marvel pivoting after years of criticism from fans who said this version of Spider-Man felt more like Iron Man Jr. than Peter Parker. So they hit reset. They stripped him of his tech, erased his connections, gave him a sewing machine and a crappy apartment, and finally said, okay, now he's Spider-Man. But if this was truly the plan, why did it take 3 movies to get here? Why did it take Tony Stark dying, Aunt May dying, and 2 other Spider-Men showing up for Peter to finally feel like Spider-Man? And that's what it all comes down to. If Marvel was really willing to toss aside the whole Tony is Peter's Uncle Ben angle by the time No Way Home rolls around, then clearly they didn't think that relationship was all that meaningful in the first place. And whose fault is that? Yep, theirs. The writers built it up just enough to use it for emotional beats, but not enough to actually stand by it long term. So when they finally needed Peter to go through a real origin story, they quietly ditched the Iron Dad thing and hoped no one would notice. But I noticed. And please don't hit me with the "this was always the plan" defense. You're telling me the same studio that's currently filming Avengers Doomsday without a finished script somehow had a meticulously plotted 3-film Spider-Man origin mapped out years in advance? Hell, Tom Holland's 3rd Spidey film was so close to not even happening because the Disney-Sony deal fell through for a while there. So excuse me for not buying that this was the plan all along. Anyway, I have a few more things to say about Aunt May's death, because this is the moment the MCU finally gives Peter the kind of defining loss that every other version of Spider-Man had already gone through. But it doesn't feel like a carefully built tragedy. It feels like Marvel needed someone to die so that Peter could finally grow up. And since Uncle Ben was never really part of this universe and the Tony Stark thing didn't actually hold emotional weight on its own, they had to pivot and give that role to May. So suddenly she's the one to deliver the iconic "with great power" line. And suddenly she's the loss that pushes Peter to mature. But just like everything else in this trilogy, it's another case of the writers going, okay, we know we skipped this part before, but we're doing it now, so just go with it. And here's the kicker. We already had a version of this moment. Sort of, all the way back in Civil War. Remember when Peter gives that awkward, jumbled version of the "great power, great responsibility" line that we mentioned earlier? At the time, that felt like Marvel's way of saying, don't worry, we covered that. He's already been through his Uncle Ben arc, we're just not spelling it out because we're different. So then, why are we doing it all over again in No Way Home? Why does May need to say the real line? Why does she need to die for Peter to finally learn it? And the irony is kind of hilarious. Peter only becomes the real Spider-Man in this universe after the other 2 Spider-Men show up, after they remind the audience what Spider-Man is actually supposed to be, after they carry the emotional weight. Marvel spent 2.5 movies trying to separate this version from everything that came before, only for No Way Home to lean entirely on nostalgia and finally admit, okay, you were right. Looking back at this trilogy, it's hard not to feel like Marvel tried to build Spider-Man using borrowed pieces, and the biggest one was Tony Stark. From Civil War to Endgame, Tony was positioned as Peter's guiding light, mentor, father figure, emotional anchor. But the problem is, the writing never earned that relationship. It was implied, not developed. It leaned on performances and dramatic music instead of moments that showed us why they actually mattered to each other. And by the time No Way Home rolled around, Marvel quietly let that entire dynamic fade into the background, like even they knew it was in the heart of Peter's story after all. So what do they do instead? They finally give Peter his tragedy, his loss, his true origin moment. But it comes 3 movies and 2 dead mentors too late. And the irony is, this stripped down, broke, alone version of Spider-Man, this is who he was supposed to be all along. Marvel spent years trying to reinvent the wheel, trying to modernize Spider-Man by surrounding him with tech and mentors and legacy characters, only to eventually realize the character never needed any of that. And for some reason people bought into it. I mean, look at this artwork. The art itself is genuinely great, but like, what fucking movies did you guys watch? Because nothing like this ever happened. In the end, they got it right. Well, I hope so at least. Everything we're hearing and seeing for next year's Spider-Man Brand New Day sounds promising, but if I've learned anything, it's to keep my expectations for MCU Spider-Man in check. What I'm really dreading is Avengers Doomsday and Secret Wars, because you just know they're gonna cash in on this phony Peter Parker Tony Stark relationship and have Doom unmasked in front of Spider-Man. And they're gonna treat it like this huge moment, but I at least have more hope in audiences in 2025 to reject slop like this as opposed to when the MCU was at its peak. But we'll see. Anyway, yes, we're basically where we need to be for the next Spider-Man movie. Finally. But they only got there after burying Uncle Ben, sidelining Peter's own growth, and forcing a relationship with Tony Stark that deep down, they didn't even seem to believe in. And maybe that's the real tragedy of this trilogy. Not what Peter lost, but how long it took the writers to figure out who he really was.